Hi everybody, hope you're doing marvelously well. What we have today is 5 mix tips that you might not know. These are ones that I have talked about in previous videos, but they're all kind of fun and I use them a lot more often than you would think. Please, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. If you hit the bell, you'll be notified when we have a new video. And of course, you can go to producelikeapro.com and sign up on the email list and get a whole bunch of free goodies. Okay, so number 1 is something I started using when I started working with basically with classic rock bands. You know, when you're working with a band that has that dynamic of a lead guitar player and a lead singer, kind of a dueling band like Zeppelin, like Aerosmith, of course, and all of those great bands that have really incredible front men, which is not just the singer, but also that lead guitarist. I found that I would have sections in songs, particularly outros, where there's a wailing guitar solo and a singer ad-libbing, and I started, mixing like, the solo up here, the lead vocalist there, and you're on faders. You've either got your fader port, you're on the console, you're automating in Pro Tools. You're doing all kinds of fun things to try and figure out how to get them to sit together. And then I just thought to myself, why don't I just duck the lead guitar when the singer is singing using sidechain compression? So let's have a look at this. Okay, so I'm going to play this outro here of this Robert John on the Wreck song. It's called Blame It on the Whiskey. Some of you must know this song. This one was mixed entirely in the box, no drum samples. It's pretty stodgy mix, clattering drums, live off the floor at Sunset Sound. And Chris, the old guitar player here, is soloing, and Robert is singing over the top. Have a listen. So the thing is, I want the lead guitar to be louder between the vocal, but I like where it's at the moment, quite frankly. Underneath the vocal, it's sitting pretty well, but I want it to come up. So let's try a couple of things. So here's Chris's solo here. It's great. You can see I've already automated the volume up here, but I've automated it up to a place where it's just loud enough, but not drowning out the vocal, which is half of the battle. But let's try bringing it up quite dramatically. So I'm going to bring it up another 2 dB or so. So let's have a listen to it now in context of the song. So I'm bringing it up another 2 dB nearly. Have a listen to this. So it's good now, but I want to center it a little bit more because, I want them to have a little bit of a competition in the middle. So this whole solo section here is presently panned entirely to the left. So let's bring it a little bit more into the center. We can go about 50%. We'll go a little bit more. We'll go like 40%. Let's have a listen. Cool. So I've had a really fun time with the God mode here, pushing up that EQ to make it really cut. Now what I'm going to do for schnitz and schniggles, I'm going to grab an R comp here, which is not going to change the character too much. So now we're going to go and grab an auxiliary on the lead vocal, and now we're going to key it to 33. Now I've set the threshold up. I've got about 3 to 1 actually. And the threshold's a little bit higher there. The volume's going to come up, but every time Bobby sings, it's going to duck. Have a listen. It's super dramatic and very obvious, so let's bring it back a little bit. Now it's stuck in about 4 dB, so we'll come back, see if we can duck in about 2 dB. There you go. So it's ducked about 2 dB every time Bobby sings. Really simple trick, and it saves me, it took me a couple of minutes, and it saves me all that time of trying to draw it in. Because it's ducking like just the phrase, the volume of the phrase. I'm not just drawing it down 2 dB where Bobby sings, it's ducking the amount of the volume when it comes up. So it's much more evenly spaced. And then between phrases here, so if you listen just here, the solo comes up ever so slightly. It's really, really tasteful. That articulation of that attack comes up because there's a moment of pause between the vocal. So it sets up a really great sensitive interplay between the lead vocal and the lead guitar. Number 2, I've done this one quite a lot. This one's a favorite of mine. Using a DI to trigger effects. So what you can do is you take like the amp track, but take the DI that you've recorded at the same time and use that to trigger reverb. It's a little bit like a similar trick where we take the snare sample and trigger the reverb and yet let the natural snare breathe. So the sample doesn't even have to be in the mix. We'll do a similar thing here with the DI. There's a slide part that Chris did here. And we can solo it for a second. It's really dirty and noisy. Kind of like it in the track. On its own, it's like, whoa, what is that? Have a listen. It fits beautifully in the track. It's totally wrong. But let's take in a good way. Sometimes it's so wrong that it's right. So let's take the DI. We'll turn it up. Like, very uninspiring, yes? Ha-ha! But how about this? Why don't we take this little reverb here? Rather good. I'm going to put a little bit of compression on here going into the reverb, just for the heck of it. So now we have this like super clean reverb behind this slide. Put that in the track. One more together, not in the track. I don't know, it makes me feel like the guitarist is standing in the room and I'm picking up the ambience of the room in a much better way than using the sound itself, the distorted sound going into the amp. I do it a lot. It's a really, really simple, interesting way to create reverb. You can do things like take the vocal an octave down and put that into a reverb. but not have the actual low octave very loud against the lead vocal. Really interesting things. We could try that just for schnitz and schniggles. So I'm just going to take stock, comes with Pro Tools plugin, and I'm going to go down 12 semitones, so 1 octave lower. Render that. Let's have a listen to it on its own. Put that with the amp. It's really messed up. I mean, the guitar part itself is really messed up. It's not like a perfect slide part at all. Put them both together. It becomes a guitar orchestra. I'm actually going to push these up a little louder, these reverbs. Again, the DI is not being used directly. It's being used just to trigger the reverb. It's a really fun thing to do. Try it on totally different things. Try it like I was saying earlier on a vocal, maybe an octave down. Just something to just give it some girth. I will do it on snare drums. Tune the snare drum down an octave, put a reverb on that, and you'll get like oof, oof behind the snare. Really interesting idea, and then just bring that in. Number 3, ducking out the snare in the overheads. I've done this in a couple of other videos and probably not focused specifically on it, but let's do it now. So if we listen to the overheads here, now there's a reason why I might want to duck it. Maybe the snare is a little loud in there. Maybe it's affecting the tonality of the snare. There's also another thing I like to do. If I grab like an R comp, for instance, the default setting on the attack and release is pretty special. They've managed to just let just enough attack to go through that you can do this. Let's take our snare top. And if you have a sample, you can use that, because the great thing about the sample, of course, is it won't have any bleed. But that doesn't, in this instance, it's not going to matter. So we're going to go and grab a bus. So here we're taking 7 from the snare top. And I'm going to go pre-fade on this bus. And now I'm going to open up. So the compressor is listening on the sidechain, is listening to the snare only. Now, I'm going to mute the snare top, but because we're on pre-fade, it's still sending to the compressor. So why am I doing this? Well, I'm doing it not just to duck the snare, but to actually exaggerate the attack of the snare. Because the default setting on this compressor allows just enough attack to go through. Have a listen. Listen to that snare. It starts to go pat, 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 just a little bit. It just starts to have a little bit of extra attack. Bypass. In. You hear that pat, pat, pat? It starts to give you that little bit of that sort of SSL pat, pat, pat. And I'm able to bring up the cymbals. So not only does it duck the snare out a little bit of the overheads, but it just adds this little extra attack in, which is really tasteful on the drum sound. It's just a nice, tasteful little extra bite. It's really kind of fun to do. Now we have a mono and a stereo overhead. So we can set this up also on the mono overhead and exaggerate that little snappiness. You could do it in room mics. You can do it in all kinds of things where you just let the attack come through and then the compressor will grab it. And it's really a nice way to add some extra attack to your snare. So here we are on the mono doing exactly the same thing. If we have a listen to that mono overhead. Just adding a little pap, pap, pap. Now remember, this is subtlety, like adding these little extra like pap, pap, pap of the attack in with the rest of the drum sound just starts to get that snare to just cut through just a little bit. I really like it. It's a great tip to kind of get that extra kind of SSL snappy pap sound that we love. You like that? Snappy pap. Number 4. The same technique, basically, but ducking the kick drum out of the snare track. This is a really fun one. On this particular recording, I had a mic on the shell of the snare drum. So the mic was actually on it because I like the sound of the shell. If you have a listen. But there's a ton of kick in it. So what we did is I took the kick drum here, so I can set that to pre-fade, coming out of the kick here on bus 1, and then turn on this compressor. The R comp is side-chained to 1. So now give it a listen. Dramatically different, and also, frankly, it adds kind of an air to the kick. We'll go in and out of bypass and you can hear the difference. This is on. Now bypass with it off. Back in. So a great technique for just ducking that kick out of the snare. Same principle that we were using on the overheads here, but really helps like give a little bit more air to the kick drum and removes the kick out of the snare. Let's have a listen to that in context. All of it together. And what I like about it is I like that snare shell sound. So it's really kind of cool because the miking on the side of the shell gives a bit more body to the snare drum rather than just the top and the bottom, which can be, I don't know the best way of describing it, but they don't always give me the best results. Like when you do snare samples, if you can bring like a large diaphragm condenser back off a snare, you get the whole sound of the snare drum. And that's what this did here. However, unfortunately, it had a lot of bleed. So running a compressor on the snare shell, then side chaining it to the kick really makes that mic completely usable. And now I've got a much bitier, more body snare as a result. 5. Last but no means least, decreasing the attack time by duplicating the file and moving it forward. This is something actually that I remember doing on tape by offsetting. This is really crazy to think that you used to be able to do this on tape. It was a pain in the butt, but you could do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to listen to the different elements of the snare. Listen to the snare bottom. Now the shell. That's just the best sound. But let's put all three together. Going to zoom in on the front of all these. The phase relationship's pretty good. We've got time adjuster on these, so it's fairly accurate between all three. I am going to take the snare top and I'm going to duplicate it. So we're duplicating everything, all the settings on it and everything. So any plugin, you name it, it's all going to be on there. We're going to duplicate it, and just for schnitz and schniggles, I'm going to consolidate, and the reason why I'm going to do that is because I want to move it forward. So now it's come forward at just a few milliseconds, and I can adjust this afterwards. I'm now going to grab a compressor for the snare, and we'll go to our R comp, and we're going to sidechain it to the snare, so we'll find another available bus, go 34. Don't need these other ones on. I'm actually going to make this output go to something that isn't being used. So it's actually, it says 2930, but it's not being used. So it's sending signal through the bus. We can put it on pre-fade. And then this compressor here is reading it. So what I'm liking about this is it's triggering it even earlier, even with the attack at its fastest time. It's super quick. It's immediately getting the first transient and just annihilating it. The shell is giving me all of that ring, the snare bottom. Now, have a listen to all the elements together. It's in bypass. More body. Bypass. Short, sharp. It's okay. Put it back on. Far more body. So what it's doing is it's rounding off that first attack. It's already compressed it, already grabbed it. It's just a really great technique to just add body, because it's like giving me this body of snare now, because there's no initial ping as it lets that attack go through and then grabs the rest of it. It's grabbing it early and from before. Really, really great technique. If you have a sample in there, you could use the sample to do it as well, because the sample wouldn't have any bleed from kicks and all that kind of stuff. So we have the shell giving us the attack we did earlier, but this is giving us body from the snare top, giving us a great snare sound with everything together. Absolutely great. No samples were harmed in doing this, and fantastic. So different ways to treat the existing elements you've got to make the snare sound more and more interesting. If you didn't have that extra element like the snare shell, but you did have a snare top on its own even, you could set it up twice. You could duplicate the snare and you could have one set of compression allowing the attack to go through. So then what would happen is you'd have that one snare just going pat, 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 pat. Then you could duplicate it and then duplicate it again, push that one forward and then control the snare so the exact reverse happens. Now it's actually the attack is starting earlier and compressing the snare so the snare's just dong, like just a lot of body, and then blend the two elements together and you'll get an amazing snare sound. So thank you ever so much for watching. Please leave a whole bunch of comments and questions below. We absolutely love seeing them. And of course, if there's some of these plugins are available down there that you can check out, there's a recommended gear list of things that I use every single day. You can check that out. And of course, please, please, please hit the subscribe button if you haven't already subscribed. Like the video, hit the notification bell when you know there's more videos. And of course, you can go to Produce Like a Pro and download a whole bunch of free goodies. Thank you ever so much. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing, and I'll see you all again very soon.